I'm John Lentz, Sydney State's Albany Bureau Chief, and joining me today is Beth Finkel, State Director of AARP New York. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, your organization recently put out a couple reports on the 50-plus population in New York City and New York State, and looking at the implications of the economy for those demographic groups. What are some of the most interesting findings that came out of these reports?
I think the most interesting one was the one that we did around the longevity economy. So we were trying to find out exactly what the 50-plus contribute to the state economy, and we found out that in fact it's equal to $600 billion, which is huge, and in fact makes up 46% of the state GDP. And when you take it down to the next notch, 44% of all state taxes are paid by the 50-plus.
And what do these data points tell you in terms of legislation, in terms of action? What should state lawmakers look at doing going forward?
Well, so in tandem with that longevity economy information that we just released, and by the way, New York State was the first state in the country that we released the data in, but on top of that, we also surveyed 50-plus voters across New York State. And what we asked them was, do they want to retire in New York? And in fact, 9 out of 10 people want to spend the rest of their days in their own communities. But when the reality sets in of how affordable New York is, that's when we get really interesting responses that are worth noting. So for instance, we found out that 60% of all 50-plus in the boomer category said that they were likely or somewhat likely to leave New York State once they retire. Now, go back to those longevity economy numbers that I just shared with you and how important that segment is to the health and vitality of the economy. How do we find out what those 50-plus voters are thinking and what's important to them that would help them stay in place? And that's what we also dived into a little bit.
Sure, and a few of the things you looked at, I think, are energy costs. That's a real issue for older Americans. Also looking at housing costs, that's a perennial issue, especially here in New York City, elsewhere. So what are the prescriptions for
So what we
dealing
found
with this?
out with affordable housing, 40% of the respondents said that they were concerned about being able to afford to pay for their rent or their mortgages. And we also found out that over 50% are really concerned with their utility costs. And that's really no surprise because New York State pays the highest utility rates in the continental United States. Only Hawaii pays more. So what can we do about that? So AARP has been advocating for an independent utility office that could be an advocate for that. So we're very hopeful about that. We've talking to a lot of policymakers, and we are hopeful for that.
And another issue, even before these reports, you've been looking at is caregivers and the burden on caregivers. And what did your report find there, and what is another pathway forward on that front?
Well, almost 50% of the people that we surveyed said that they had been caregivers. And in fact, 46% of them were in the workforce. So what happens when you're a caregiver and you're in the workforce and you have to be worrying all the time that the phone is going to ring, that something's going to happen at home, that someone's going to need your assistance? So it's a major concern. There are 4 million New Yorkers that are currently caregiving. That's a very large number. Now, those people are at home, in their own homes or in their families' homes, but they're in the community, right? They're not in institutional care. But if some of those people could not care for their loved ones, those people would then have to move into institutional care. And we know that the payer of, I was going to say last resort, but the most common payer for long-term care in New York State is Medicaid. And if we can work on trying to hold people in their communities where they're less likely to be on Medicaid and using those dollars, we'll be saving New York State and New York City significant dollars.
And there has been legislation for a while now to address this issue. Maybe it's changed somewhat.
The CARE Act, yes.
Right, tell me about that. What would that do?
Well, we're excited about that. Rosenthal and Hannan both introduced the bill this past year, so we're very optimistic for the 2015 ledge season that the needs of the family caregivers are going to be addressed.
And anything else we should know about these reports?
Well, I think that you need to look at all the other ramifications of the economy, the longevity economy, and what happens if people end up leaving New York. Then they take their pensions with them, they take their Social Security with them. These are people who spend their money locally in the community, right? They go to the local grocery store, the local dry cleaner, the movie theater, etc. And so if they are not spending that money, then the local merchants are not taking in that money, and then that in turn has that snowball effect of less money that pours into the state coffers also. And I just want to make one more point, because we really are not just talking about dollars here, we're talking about the human capital also. And when you look out into the community and see who's volunteering, who's making the YMCA run, and the churches and the synagogues and United Way and everything else, all those agencies, the backbone of that is the 50-plus volunteer. And so if those people decide to live elsewhere, then we also lose that human capital, and that would be a pity.
Beth Finkel, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Jonathan.